The JD dealer mocked his $40 secondhand plow. 5 years later, he was his biggest customer. The estate auction for Elmer Schutt's farm came on a Thursday morning in March of 1978, and Ray Hollis drove 18 miles from his rented place outside Wadena before sunrise to get there ahead of the bidding. He arrived at 6:40 in the morning and parked on the road shoulder. The sky was still dark at the east edge and coming up pale gray behind the Schutt property. He could see his breath in the cold air. The auction lot smelled of old machinery oil and frozen ground, and the diesel exhaust drifting from the generator running the office trailer at the yard entrance. Other men were already walking the rows, hands in their jacket pockets, pausing at different pieces, not staying long enough to show real interest. He'd seen this at farm auctions for years. A man who lingered was a man who wanted something. He walked the rows without lingering. He was 44 years old, had been farming rented ground in Fayette County, Iowa since 1969, 9 years across 3 different landlord arrangements, moving when a lease ended or a landlord situation changed. He currently had 80 acres outside Wadena under agreement at $72 an acre per year, a figure his landlord had raised from $64 the previous fall and would raise again the fall after that. The 80 acres kept him in operation. They did not build anything. He needed a plow. His 3-bottom International Harvester pull type, which he'd been using since 1973, had cracked its main beam frame in November on a buried concrete footing near the northeast corner of the rented field. He'd welded it twice. The second weld had held through the remaining fall tillage, but he didn't trust it for a full spring season of primary work through Fayette County clay loam. The repair had cost him a day and a half and $32 in rod and grinding supplies. A third attempt at the same crack would likely split the beam entirely. He'd been watching the classified columns in the Fayette County Union and the equipment listings board at the West Union Co-op since December. The Schutt auction sheet listed a 3-bottom moldboard plow, make unspecified, condition described as fair. He found it in the 3rd row, between a hay mower and a set of disc gangs. An Alice Chalmers Model 66 pull-type moldboard plow, 3-bottom. The paint had been orange once. It had gone to the color of old brick in most places, bare steel showing through on the beam and the hitch plate where paint and rust had both worn away. He ran his hand along the main beam, checking for cracks, checking for old weld repairs. Nothing. He worked each adjustment bolt with his thumb and forefinger. Stiff, but moving. He checked the shares, the curved steel cutting blades at the base of each moldboard. Worn past the point of useful life, but shares were replaceable at the co-op parts counter for under $10 apiece. He checked the 5 coulters, the round cutting discs mounted forward on the frame. 3 of them still had workable edges. The hitch plate was solid. He crouched and sighted down the main beam from the hitch end. Straight, no twist. He stood beside the plow for 2 full minutes without touching anything else. He thought about the weld on his International Harvester. He thought about the $440 new JD 3-bottom he'd seen in the Millard catalog that winter. He thought about what $40 left in his account versus $1. $440 charged against it meant for his operating margin going into spring. He won it at $40. The other bidder, a man from near El Dorado he recognized from the grain elevator, stopped at $35. Ray bid $40 and the paddle came down. He loaded it onto his transport wagon before the auction crowd had fully cleared and drove back toward Wadena. The coulters vibrated against the wagon's steel bed with a low rhythmic rattle on the gravel stretches. He pulled into the equipment shed at home and sat in the tractor cab for a moment after he shut the engine off. Then, he went inside and made coffee. He spent the next 2 weekends going through the Alice Chalmers on the shed floor. He replaced all 3 worn shares with new ones. $9.40 each at the West Union Co-op parts counter, $28.20 total. He sharpened the 2 serviceable coulters on the bench grinder, working each one until the edge held light the way it was supposed to, and replaced the 3rd with a new one from the co-op stock. He reset the beam angle to proper working depth using an adjustment chart from a manual he'd borrowed from the county extension office in West Union. The plow needed one more part, a spring-tooth coulter bracket and 2 5/8-inch grade 8 hex bolts. The co-op didn't carry Alice Chalmers' specific hardware. He drove to Millard Farm Equipment in West Union. Gerald Millard had run the John Deere dealership on the south end of West Union since 1961. The lot carried 5 or 6 new tractors at any given time. A row of planter and tillage equipment laid out under the metal canopy along the south wall, and a parts counter in the back of the showroom floor. It was the largest farm equipment operation in Fayette County. The showroom smelled of new rubber and machine oil, and the faint varnish smell of fresh paint on metal. Ray went to the parts counter and asked for a coulter bracket assembly, Alice Chalmers 66 application, and 2 5/8-inch grade 8 hex bolts. The parts man told him they didn't stock Alice components, but could order the bracket. Lead time 2 to 3 weeks. Gerald Millard came out of the back office while Ray was writing his name and phone number on the order slip. Millard stopped in the middle of the showroom floor and looked out the window toward the lot. He asked Ray what he had hitched to the Ford out there. Ray told him. Alice Chalmers 66. 3 bottom pull type, bought at the Schutt Estate auction. Millard asked what he'd paid for it. Ray told him. Millard turned to his parts man and said they had a live one. Then he turned back to Ray and said they had a new JD3 bottom set up out under the canopy, completely ready to work. And that if Ray wanted a plow that would still be turning ground in June, rather than sitting in a welding shop, he might want to walk out and look at it before driving home. Ray said he'd pass for now. Millard told him the price was $140 and it wouldn't hold past the 1st of May. Ray said he appreciated that. He paid $1.60 for the 2 bolts, told the parts man he'd call back in 3 weeks on the bracket, and drove back toward Wadena. The Alice Chalmers rattled on the wagon the same way it had on the drive over. He put the new bolts in that evening in the shed under the overhead light. He had the plow ready to work by the 1st week of April. The spring of 1978 stayed wet through most of April. Ray walked the 80-acre field each morning in his rubber boots, checking the soil with his heel and watching how the top layer responded to pressure. On April 23rd, it held. He hooked the Alice Chalmers to the Ford 8000 and ran the first furrow at 7:10 in the morning, entering at the south fence and pushing through 8 inches of black Fayette County clay loam, with the Ford pulling steady and even. The smell of fresh-turned earth came through the open cab window, heavy and dark with the moisture the ground had been holding since the previous November. He ran the field north to south in long passes, turning at each fence. The plow moved through the soil without pulling to either side. The replaced shares turned clean furrows. The new coulter bracket the co-op had ordered arrived the previous week and held without movement on the first pass or any that followed. He worked 47 acres before dark, finished the remaining 33 the following morning before noon. At the West Union Co-op a week later, while loading seed corn, he ran into 2 neighboring farmers at the loading dock. One asked how his spring tillage had gone. Ray said he'd gotten through it in 2 days. The man asked what plow he was running. Ray mentioned the Alice Chalmers from the Schutt sale. The man said he'd walked past that plow at the auction and kept walking. Said he'd ended up buying a new 2-bottom from Millard's, and it had been a different experience entirely. The second man said something similar. That old equipment always cost you twice in repair time what you saved up front on the price. Ray said he was glad their new equipment was working out. He loaded his seed and drove back to Wadena. He planted the 80 acres by the third week of May, 60 in corn, 20 in soybeans. The Alice Chalmers sat through the summer in the equipment shed, the shares still holding their edge, the beam and hitch unchanged. The 1978 corn came off at 119 bushels per acre. The elevator price in West Union in October was $2.28 per bushel. He paid his lease, his diesel account, his seed and chemical bills at the co-op, and had $3,100 left over. He deposited it at First National Bank of West Union into the savings account he'd been building since 1975. After the deposit, the account held $7,200. The following spring, 1979, his landlord offered him an additional 40 acres on the north end of the property, a parcel a retired neighbor had been leasing and was giving up. Same rate, same terms. Ray said yes without much deliberation. He was now farming 120 acres with the same equipment. The Alice Chalmers worked the additional parcel that spring the same way it had worked the 80, steady, consistent, without incident. He finished primary tillage on 120 acres in 3.5 days. The plow ran without adjustment from the previous season's settings. By October 1979, he had $6,900 in the savings account. In 3 years of farming 80 and then 120 acres with the same $40 plow, he had accumulated more working capital than in his previous 6 years, combined on smaller and less efficient parcels. He didn't say this to anyone. He wrote the number in his composition book and went on. In the summer of 1980, he heard that Clarence Weimer, who farmed 40 acres on the east side of Wadena Road, was talking to his daughter about selling. Clarence was 74. He'd been farming lighter each year since his wife died in 1977, and the 40 acres had been showing it. The fence rows needed attention. The tile drainage hadn't been touched in 3 years. The ground itself was good. Same Fayette County clay loam as the rented acres to the south. Ray drove to Clarence's house on a Tuesday evening in August, and they sat at the kitchen table. Clarence wanted $820 per acre, 40 acres. Total price, $32,800. Ray had $6,900. He went to Howard Pfeiffer at First National Bank of West Union. Pfeiffer had processed his operating loans for 3 years and had Ray's field records and grain receipts on file going back to 1976. He looked at the numbers and the land appraisal for 2 days. He told Ray he could approve a $25,900 note at 12.5% interest. The rates in the fall of 1980 were not favorable. They hadn't been favorable since 1978 and would get worse before they improved. Pfeiffer said so plainly. Ray said he understood. He signed the papers in October and recorded the deed at the Fayette County Courthouse the following week. He owned 40 acres. He had a $25,900 note and a first payment due in March. He planted the Weimer ground in April of 1981. The Alice Chalmers worked it on a Tuesday, running from the Wadena Road fence east to the tree line. 44 passes across 40 acres, the same black clay loam he'd been running since 1978. He finished before 4 in the afternoon and drove back to the shed. He wrote the date in his field records composition book, a brown-covered notebook he'd been keeping since 1970, noting planting dates, fertilizer costs, yields by field, and equipment hours. First season on owned ground. It was a Tuesday. He didn't mark it as anything special. By fall 1981, he was farming 240 acres across 4 separate parcels. He'd taken on 80 rented acres from a neighbor in Westfield Township who was pulling back his operation. He'd installed a used grain dryer the previous winter, a 14,000 BTU unit from a retiring operation south of Hawkeye, $1,100 for the unit and $280 to move and set it. And was storing corn on farm for the first time instead of trucking everything to the elevator at harvest. Delivering in January, when prices typically firmed, had added $880 net to his grain revenue in the first season. Howard Pfeiffer at First National looked at the fall numbers and said Ray was running tighter margins with better outcomes than most farm operations he worked with in the county. He said it as a matter of fact, without particular warmth. Ray thanked him and drove back to the farm. In the winter of 1981 to 1982, Ray drove out to 3 farms in neighboring townships and spoke with 2 older farmers looking to reduce their workloads. By April, he had 2 new lease agreements signed, 80 acres in Westfield Township and 120 acres southeast of Hawkeye. Together with what he already had, he was farming 440 acres going into the 1982 season. The Alice Chalmers 3 bottom was not enough plow for 440 acres in a 10-day planting window. A 3 bottom pull type at 8 inches of depth covered roughly 3.5 acres per hour under normal conditions. At that rate, 440 acres of primary tillage required about 126 hours of plow time. A 10-day window, working 12 hours a day, gave him 120 hours. The math was tight on a dry spring. It was impossible on a wet one. He borrowed a neighbor's 4 bottom for the spring of 1982 and returned the favor in 2 days of labor on the neighbor's ground. The arrangement held that year because the spring cooperated. A wet May would have cost him planting days he could not get back, and in 1982 he was fortunate. He used the neighbor's plow for 2 more weeks after planting. When he returned it, the neighbor, a man named Gus Sievers, who farmed 260 acres north of Hawkeye and had been farming that ground since 1958, looked at the Alice Chalmers on Ray's wagon and asked how many seasons he'd put on it. Ray told him. Sievers said nothing for a moment. Then, he said he'd always figured that plow would have cracked through before spring of '79. Ray said it hadn't. He spent the winter of 1982 to 1983 building a list. 7 items. A 4-wheel drive tractor. A 6-row planter. A tandem disc. A 4-bottom plow. A 250-bushel grain cart. A new header reel for the combine he co-leased with 2 other county farmers. A set of 20-foot field cultivators for secondary tillage. He priced each item through January from dealer catalogs and used equipment listings in the farm papers and on the co-op listings board in West Union. The total came to between $68,000 and $82,000 depending on new versus used at each line. He went to Howard Pfeiffer at First National in December with his own acreage valuations. Pfeiffer looked at the land appraisals. 100 acres owned, appraised at $91,000. And the operating history, and told Ray the bank would back him. Ray said he'd have a firm number after he got equipment quotes in January. He called 3 dealers, 1 in Olwine, 1 in Independence, 1 in West Union. Gerald Millard called Ray at the farm on a Tuesday afternoon in February of 1983 and said he'd like to drive out and go through the list in person. Said he'd bring spec sheets and a John Deere credit financing page. Ray said Thursday would work. Millard drove out on a Thursday in late February. The farmyard was frozen solid, wheel ruts locked in the mud from December. Millard climbed out of his company truck and shook Ray's hand, and they walked the operation together. The grain bins, the dryer, the 2 tractors, the equipment under the canopy. They went through the main equipment shed. In the far corner, the Alice Chalmers Model 66 sat where it had been sitting since the previous fall. Frame solid, paint almost entirely gone to bare steel. 5 seasons of Fayette County primary tillage behind it. Millard stopped and looked at it for a moment, hands in his jacket pockets. Then he walked on. Ray followed. Neither man said anything. They sat at the kitchen table. Ray had his list and his pricing research in a manila folder, catalog page numbers written beside each item with a competitive price. Millard had his spec sheets and a JD credit financing rate card. They went through each line over 55 minutes. On the four-wheel drive tractor, Millard quoted a new JD 4440 at $47,900. On the six-row planter, a new JD 7000 at $8,600. On the disc, a new JD 110 tandem at $6,200. On the four-bottom plow, a new JD unit at $2,100. On the grain cart, a used 250 bushel trade-in from a Chickasaw County farm at $3,800. Total, with a trade allowance on the Ford 8000 at $9,400, $59,200, financed through John Deere Credit at 11.75%. Millard put the rate sheet on the table and pushed it across. Ray said he'd give the other quotes until Monday before he called back. He called Millard on Monday morning. The Independence dealer had come in $200 under on the planter. Millard's service department was 18 miles from the farm. Independence was 34. When something broke down at planting time, those 16 miles were ours. He told Millard yes on the full package. The delivery ran across 3 days in March of 1983. The JD 4440 came first on a Millard flatbed, dark green cab, yellow chassis, engine idling in the farmyard with the steady, even sound of a machine that had more in reserve than it was using. The planter and disc came the next day. The plow and grain cart the day after. Ray's neighbor from Westfield Township slowed his truck at the end of the farm drive when the second flatbed went past on the county road. He sat there at the road end for a full minute before driving on. Ray put the new four-bottom in the equipment shed beside the Alice Chalmers. He looked at both of them for a moment. Then he closed the shed door and went to the house. He retired the Alice Chalmers from active use that spring. It had run 5 seasons, 1978 through 1982, across 780 acres of primary tillage work on 4 separate parcels in Fayette County, Iowa. He'd replaced the shares twice. Total investment beyond the $40 auction purchase, 94 to 30 cents, counting the replacement shares, the new coulter, and the 2 grade 8 bolts from Millard's parts counter in March of 1978. He kept it in the corner of the shed. The operation grew through the rest of the 1980s. By 1987, he was farming 620 acres, owning 260 of them. He bought equipment from Millard's at regular intervals, a used combine in 1985, a second JD 4440 in 1987, a 12-row planter in 1988. He paid cash on the smaller items and financed the larger ones through John Deere Credit at Millard's front desk. Gerald Millard retired in 1991 and sold the dealership to his son-in-law Dale Shriver, who had been running the service department since 1984. Shriver kept the Millard name on the building and called Ray every spring to talk through that season's needs. Ray continued to buy from them. He farmed the Fayette County ground until 1999. He was 65 years old that fall. He'd spent 9 years building the operation and 21 years running it. He sold it to a partnership of 2 brothers from Kalmar, both mid-30s, looking for established ground with infrastructure already in place. The sale included the owned land, the bins, the dryer, and most of the equipment. The 2 JD 4440 tractors, the combine, the 12-row planter, the tandem disc, the 4-bottom John Deere plow he'd bought from Millard's in March of 1983 and run through 16 seasons. The Alice Chalmers Model 66 was not in the sale. Ray pulled it from the shed corner the day before closing and hauled it on a flatbed trailer to his smaller property outside Wadena. One of the brothers who bought the operation walked over on closing day and asked what it was. Ray told him, Alice Chalmers 66. Bought at the Shutt Estate auction in March of 1978 for $40. Put $94 more into it over 5 seasons. Ran it across 780 acres of Fayette County ground. The brother looked at it for a moment. Then he went back to finish signing. The plow is still on the trailer behind the small shed outside Wadena. Frame solid. Both rear tires flat. The adjustment hardware seized in place from years without use. Ray donated the shares to a farm heritage museum outside the town of Fayette in 2001. They were assembling a tillage equipment display, and a volunteer came out with a trailer. The man asked where the plow had come from originally. Ray told him. $40. March of 1978. Elmer Schutt's estate auction. Fayette County, Iowa. Dale Shriver at Millard Farm Equipment sent Ray a Christmas card every December from 1992 until Ray sold the operation in 1999. The card had the Millard logo on it and a printed note thanking him for his business that year and looking forward to working with him in the year ahead. 8 cards in total. Ray kept them in the kitchen drawer with the field records from the last seasons. The beam holds. Still holding.